Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, of course, Louka Parry, and it's my absolute delight to today have one of my favorite human beings on the podcast. We are speaking with Professor Pascale Quester. She is the Vice-Chancellor and President of Swinburne University of Technology, which is one of Australia's leading research and innovation-led institutions. She commenced her tenure in August 2020. And she's been reappointed. She's going to be out there till 2030. So we're going to talk a little bit about the future of that. Before joining Swinburne, she actually served at the University of Adelaide, which is my hometown. And she held several leadership roles, including Executive Dean, Professor of Marketing, and others. She hails from her native France, but she has studied in the US. She has a PhD from Massey University in New Zealand, very much a global citizen, Pascal. And whenever we happen to talk, I'm always kind of elevated by the generative space of the ideas. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Good to be with you, Louka.
It's fantastic. My first question is always the same, and it's what is something that you are learning at the moment, something that's capturing your attention, Pascal?
Well, something that I probably knew intuitively to be true, but realize as we go forward with a very transformative strategic plan is how deep down many educators remain quite conservative. And, nowhere is it more evident than when we start talking about the holy grail of assessment, which of course has come under question because of all of the AI and the capacity that AI has to cheat at writing essay. And of course, the inevitable question is, so why are we assessing with essays? And this is where you see a wall of kind of resistance to come. I was always, assessed with essay. Yes. And why does it make it the right type of assessment? So you actually find that people tend to naturally coalesce around the familiar, and the familiar is the way they were taught. And then immediately you start to say, what if things were entirely different? And I'm always surprised that educators who should be always kind of tempted to learn and keen to learn are actually people who tend to be actually very unable to unlearn the way things were.
It's a profound statement. The future doesn't belong to those that can't read and write, but those who can unlearn and relearn. This is one of Alvin Toffler quote. And so take us into, at the moment, if we just take a step back, we're in this moment, it's 2026. We have this new wave of quite transformational technology that's shifting the kind of macroeconomic climate, certainly the tasks. And so, I really want this conversation to be from your lens, which is uniquely kind of thinking about the future of higher education. And so take us into the project of transforming Swinburne, but also more broadly about the kind of the raison d'etre of a university in 2030, for example.
So I'm a bit torn between the kind of the view that perhaps we overstate the momentous step that we have to confront, and sometimes understate it. And I'm really intrigued by this intersection of technology and learning, and how that is going to kind of play out in the future, not in a way that I think most people think as a kind of substitution that, people will use AI instead of. Whereas I
Yes.
think it's actually quite additive. It's quite kind of complementary. It's quite symbiotic. What if we learned with AI? And that's a completely different proposition. But I think that as people kind of talk about how, we are on the verge of something kind of catastrophic, the book was the actual technology that transformed learning in medieval time. And the lecture, I like to remind my colleagues who never want to let go of the lecture or want to make it compulsory before people can sit exam, that the lecture was devised as a method to kind of do what the books could not do because they were not affordable at the time. And then we had the book, but we still kept the lecture. And at some point you said, okay, so we've had the books for 1,000 years now. Isn't it time we let go of the lecture? Can't we just kind of step to the next thing? And there is that sense that, we tend to kind of see AI as this enormously transformative technology, but we've had others. And yet we have kind of maintained or always seen that new technology as yet another layer we put on top. What if we didn't need anything below? If we had that, what if that layer on top was strong enough, solid enough, or different enough that we actually didn't need all the stuff underneath? And that's kind of what I'm intrigued in kind of exploring. What do we need underneath?
it's so fascinating. It's almost like thinking about what are the minimum viable requirements for it to kind of, it's a new model rather than this idea of, yeah, as you say, you kind of pave, as we do in human history, we just pave on top of everything else that came before.
Mhm.
We don't necessarily remove it and redesign it and think differently about the utility. I find that really interesting and compelling. And as someone that's leading, the complex organization that is a university, take us a little bit into the world of 2030, especially I know quite well, I know a little bit about your university, having, done some work with you, but I'm, this idea about Astra, the idea of a quantum leap rather than incremental improvement. Yeah. Where do you want to
So,
go?
and that's where we really wanted. In fact, one of the kind of interesting things about this strategic plan is that we had a very broad conversation, and we invited not just staff but students and partners and just about everybody who wanted to be part of that conversation. And I was quite open in saying, and this is because we're going to have AI help us read through all of that contribution by people, and then we'll extract the theme. But instead of just taking them as, kind of divine manna, we'll just reflect them back to people, and people will have a chance to interpret what it means. And then we will
Mm,
actually have the cognitive rigor of making sure that we're taking the things that are transversal, the thing that binds us together, instead of the thing that makes us, as always, we tend to go into the vertical and the silo. So it was actually a really good demonstration of how AI can help you do all of that kind of labor intensive compilation of things, but you don't take that for granted. It's not the full reality. You've got to reflect it back. You've got to get people's advice on it. They have to respond to it. And I'll give one example because, our new strategic plan has got 4 quantum leaps, but it started with initially 5. And there was one that was about, it was a bit similar to the 4th moonshot of the previous strategic plan. It was all about wanting to be entrepreneurial and be willing to fail and being the prototype of something that is the university of the future rather than the reflection of something that was a university of the past. And at some point, people reflected and saying, hang on a minute, this is not a separate thing. We should do that in everything else we do. So instead of having a 5th quantum leap that mandated it, that we should be entrepreneurial, we decided to be entrepreneurial in the other 4 quantum leaps, and then made it all the more sort of real and authentic because it was actually the human take on what otherwise would have been the AI conclusion. And I think this is where the nexus is. That combination of the critical thinking and the way of looking at the narrative rather than just kind of taking the summary view of what everybody else has been saying, because people have only got that capacity for extrapolation. You want to kind of really force, and I think this is where learning happens. We'll probably be talking about that in the next half hour, which is, learning is hard. And if it's not
yes.
hard, it's not learning. And so this whole notion that we've got to somehow protect the students and have trigger warning and just make it all so lovely and warm and comfortable. Well, there's no learning happening if it's easy, because learning is about transforming your cognitive pathways, and it is about reshaping your brain. And surely that can't happen in a completely sort of harmonious, sugary way. But yet the resilience, we were saying before, what is underneath? I think underneath any learning, there has to be a resilient learner that is not only willing, but actually anxious to kind of be uncomfortable. Because if they don't, then the learning is going to be constrained.
Yes. I think that's put so beautifully. And of course, there's a lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment, Pascal, are really centering on this question. The idea of friction is something I'm very curious about in particular, and I think you started to allude to it, the difference between a performance pathway versus a learning pathway. And so if the assessment is about performance, well, then I will offload all my cognition to just give you a product. And then, of course, the data will suggest as soon as I've submitted it, I don't remember any of it. So one of the issues of
So gone.
cramming is also the same issue. It's gone, right? I haven't reshaped my cognitive pathways, as you say, versus this process in where there's grappling, there's struggle, there's discomfort, there's negative affect even as part of
Yes.
that cognitive piece. So I don't feel good because I'm working really hard. But then, of course, there's the accomplishment of achieving something. And I think there's this very interesting moment where we see, as you know, and you're kind of in this space around business and marketing too, an obsession with frictionless experience in the digital world. And so, of course, That's fine if you want to sell people a product. But of course, in education, we're selling fiction, are we not?
Yes.
Where do you sit on this?
See, we're a university of technology. So I often say, that it's actually a law of physics that you need a friction to get a spark. So if you get no friction, you get no spark. But at the same time, I would say the friction we have to be discriminant in where we apply the friction. The friction has
Yes.
to be in the learning. What you don't want to do is to make it an obstacle course for a student to enroll. You don't want it to make an obstacle course for a student to go from a vocational to a higher education pathway, for instance. So that bit absolutely needs to be frictionless, because the friction may discourage people from continuing, and then it may just turn away people who are full of talent and could contribute in whatever way. But the friction in the learning, if it's obvious to you, it's probably not going to kind of stretch your cognitive capacity, and you're probably not going to learn something. And in fact, sometimes, and as you say, I'm a marketing person. Everybody knows marketing, right? It's easy. You just kind of look at TV and you've got that, like, people assume that it's easy. And if they assume that it is easy, they don't actually learn the hard stuff, which is the psychology, the economics, the behavioral science, the digital element, and all the rest of it that can actually make it a quite challenging discipline. But there are other disciplines where you can't get past first base if you don't actually learn some stuff. And it's not going to come to you naturally. Geometry, trigonometry. Nobody's born knowing about trigonometry. But if you don't learn that, then how are you going to move into the world of physics, right? The question is, how do we make the reward loop? I'm a behavioral scientist. Children need to have that feedback loop that encourages them. And as you said, the feeling of achievement is one thing, but also the notion of the kind of the curiosity for its own sake, the awesomeness of the universe. And one of the things that we're doing at Swinburne, which is quite an investment, is to actually create immersive experiences where kids, as young as primary school kids, will be able to see how, the universe works. What happens when quasar collides, and what happens when a black hole does something weird. Because that you can't help wanting to know more. And then if you're told that this happened 8 billion years ago and we're just showing it to you on screen, but wouldn't that be nice to understand how that works? If you don't get that initial reward and feedback that makes a child wants to learn more, then you miss the chance. And I think you actually probably don't get too many chances. That if you switch off that curiosity and feedback loop in an early child, it's not in year 12 that you're going to rekindle it. I think there needs to be a reinforcement. It's shaping behavior, right? You encourage it and you reward it in such a way that it is repeated, and people have to be resilient and they have to be able to cope with failure. But if you have repeated experiences of failure, then you stop trying. And so
Yes.
it's the right balance between making things challenging but not overwhelmingly difficult. It's not an obstacle course, other than if there is an obstacle course, it's kind of customized to the
Hmm.
fitness of the person, as opposed to kind of only meant for champions to kind of
Yes. An
conquer.
elite. You look
And
at it, you go, I don't know.
I
Yeah.
do actually think this is where the educator skills comes in. So for me, the where technology is going to play a major part, and in some ways it's the kind of opposite of what marketing has been doing for decades. Instead of trying to kind of segment people and group them in herds of like people who do need the same thing, the technology will enable us to customize. And if we can get to that holy grail of customizing education so that people have got the right mix of challenge, reward, and resilience building element and experiences, then I think we're onto a really good thing.
I was just thinking about a nuance as you were talking then. Struggle is one thing, but of course, productive struggle is a better frame. Because of course, we can have unproductive struggle. And I think to your point, and I think when we think about equity, there's so much unproductive struggle in some ways that prevent people from stepping into. Whereas within the learning experience, if you're grappling, it should be leading you towards, be it a developmental continuum of something or a new understanding or a new skill. I find that quite compelling. The other question I want to just come to is about really knowledge and transfer. Because as you've said, you took what was going to be a fifth focus group on enterprise entrepreneurship. And you then said, no, this is part of everything we do at a university. Now, some people, I'm not necessarily one of them, but some people would say, well, universities just teach knowledge, Pascale. They're not connected to the real world. You know, you don't even need a university degree anymore. You can just go straight into the workforce and the L&D. What's the case that you make? Because clearly universities do need to be closer to transfer, but there's an assumption there that you're not doing it already.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been perplexed, and maybe because in Australia we like to keep things simple. So you're in that team or you're in that team, and you play that league or you play that league, and so it's very dichotomous, right? We like to bifurcate. And one of the big bifurcation, which I think we're paying the price for now, has been the kind of the vocational is here and it's dealt with by the state, and then the higher education is here. And I have had famous conversation with vice-chancellors who will remain unnamed, where I quite enjoyed demonstrating to them that if they had a medical school, they had the most vocational course ever. Because it's
Absolutely.
not as clear-cut as this. You can't prepare a musician in a conservatorium in a university and say you don't do vocational, because they're going to practice on that violin for many years before they get to mastery, right? And you
Yes.
wouldn't launch a doctor, a dentist, or a vet on the general public without giving them a fair amount of very practical training. And likewise, there is this expectation that people who do vocational courses are somehow lobotomized and they don't think at all. And it's a ridiculous characterization. And so I'm blessed with the fact that my university is a dual sector university. I see this as a really incredibly timely and necessary evolution of the system. Because if you look at each learner individually, they probably will require a different mix of vocational skills and kind of knowledge foundation. But I would also argue they will need to be equipped to acquire skills and to acquire knowledge throughout the rest of their lives. So giving them just one thing is going to put them on a track to nowhere, really. Because to me, the capacity to adapt will come from this particular mix of skill and knowledge, which I think just about every possible job will actually require them to have. So I refuse to kind of typecast our vocational learners as people who can't think. And I refuse to typecast our higher education learners as people who can't actually do things. And I think this is where, in terms of authentic assessment, I much prefer to have a learner demonstrate what it is that they can do with their skills and knowledge than somebody who can tell me what it is that they know is in the textbook somewhere, because I have no idea whether they can make use of that. And
Yes.
so, I come back to this notion of authentic assessment. How do we actually ensure that people have a capacity to demonstrate what they can do, whereas currently the assessment and the exam in particular, which I have a particular dislike of,
Yes.
an exam is there to test what you can't do and then take marks of you for what you can't do. It's incredibly deficit creating, right?
Yeah.
So
Great point.
having the capacity to demonstrate what you can do and whether you can do it because you've had these skills or that knowledge, it's probably the way you combine the two to come up to an outcome, a solution, a recommendation, a creation, if it's an architect project. That is, to me, the test of whether or not you've integrated that learning into a coherent way of finding solutions to problems.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. I think this assessment question is one of the great questions for our learning systems. What are some of the stories or maybe experiments or use cases, Pascal, that you're playing with as a university, knowing that, as we started with, as educators, we can often grasp to our most familiar ways of doing and being. And so what are you seeing emerge? What do you think is needed, even as this world of kind of the hybrid virtual tutor plus the analog social cognition aspect collide?
There's a great deal of conflicting elements in this. I mean, the higher education is characterized by third-party accreditation, which are really problematic because they tend to hold to a very established model. In fact, that's kind of almost their raison d'etre, right? So they're there to make sure that everybody does it the way that it was done to them. I have been known I've been known to describe exams to those people as intergenerational abuse. But, I do think that for some of them, their love of exam comes from the fact that they've suffered them and therefore they want to inflict them in future generation, which I think is a
It's
strange
very
motivation.
interesting.
But the reality of how this works is that the minute you start taking away the traditional exam, you are immediately going to be accused of dropping standards. You're immediately going to be accused of letting through students who don't deserve to pass. And, so again, this notion of stage gate, we're here to stop the students from progressing. And they're there to kind of show that we're wrong in telling them they can't, right? Which I think is just a very warped way of going about it. So in terms of how we've been, of course, we are, experimental and entrepreneurial. So we didn't kind of start everywhere, but we started in our School of Design. And the way that we thought about it is if you were a practicing designer or an architect, in the professional environment, if you come up with a project that is not up to scratch, you're very unlikely to be told by the senior partner that this is a 3 out of 10. Now go and do another project. That's not what's going to happen. You're going to be told this is not good enough. Go back and do it
Yes.
until we tell you it's good enough, right? So that's actually what we do in the School of Design. You work on your project, you present this, you get feedback, and if it's not good enough, you're going to go back, and you are charged with fixing it. And in demonstrating that you can fix whatever it is, you show two things. You show that you've been able to understand the feedback. You've been able to analyze that feedback and determine what's relevant and what's not. You've been able in your own mind to determine what it is that you need to do and those things that you disagree with. And then you're going to come back with your next iteration where you're going to say, and I didn't do this because, but I did that because, and the way I did that is that like that. Now, this is an incredibly more constructive and intelligent way. And what it does mean is that in the world of work, when you get in there, you're not going to kind of get in the fetal position. And the minute somebody tells you you're not brilliant because your project is not fantastic, you're actually going to say, okay, well, I didn't think about that. So thank you for the feedback. I'm going to go back and think about it. And there's nothing, in some ways you'll grow faster and you'll grow stronger because as long as the feedback is provided in a way that is constructive, and, in some professions, that's not always the case. Sometimes people think they shine through the cruelty with which they inflict feedback, and that's not good either.
Mm.
But it has actually shown great promise in that school because we are building professionals who are going to be in a position to understand feedback, take it on board, argue with it, not take it blindly, but then go back and produce something better. Now, of course, it's not going to be applicable in the same way in all discipline and in all walks of life. But the notion of actually assessing people on their capacity to integrate their initial understanding and then to iterate once they got additional feedback and then kind of contemplate the validity or otherwise of those things that have been said to them. That's an incredibly more intelligent way of demonstrating that you understand something.
It's brilliant. I'm also thinking about the layer. It's far more sophisticated, isn't it, Pascal? It's really kind of assessment for the 21st century. But I'm also thinking about what we're learning from the kind of generative AI space and agentic AI space soon to be, where rather than being just the sole producer, you're effectively becoming increasingly a reviewer. You're becoming a manager. And so even the capacity to give feedback to somebody becomes a key skill. Why? Because you can increase your productivity, supposedly, by being able to prompt intelligently to give critical feedback and to iterate a project to a point at which you think it meets a particular standard, which is a professional standard. So I really just think that's a compelling way. Where do you find, Pascal? Because, there'll be people that'll say, well, we need the gates, Pascal. There should be
Quality
these
control.
things.
Quality control. Right?
Quality control. Yeah, exactly right. Well, how will we really know? I mean, and I think there's something about, evidencing, which is, of course, the work that we talk about at Learning Quest Australia a bit. How do we think about evidencing, the ability to apply feedback to iterate versus this idea that there is a single moment in time where you must impress upon us your ability to recall and in some ways synthesize knowledge to create some kind of answers. But, it so rarely falls into that practical realm where it's useful, perhaps.
And I think, part of the issue that we grapple with is that the model of universities, certainly in Australia, has been one where size has been equated to the capacity to do things. The method of assessment that I've just described, we couldn't do it if we were a university twice our size. And that's precisely why in our strategic plan, we have not wanted to become just bigger, but just better at a few things. And I think there is, I mean, it seemed incredibly new in Australia when I said, no, we don't want to get bigger. We just want to get better at the things we do, which means, by the way, that we are going to stop doing things. And shock horror, we were going to kind of abandon some areas. That's the only way to avoid becoming just bigger, right? And my view was that in a sector, and I've described the sector as a reef where there were already too many whales. We didn't want another whale. We certainly didn't need to be another whale. So we needed to be something else that added to the ecosystem in a way that was differentiated but useful, compatible as well as different.
Mm.
So we were not trying to eradicate all the species on the reef to kind of, bring our own species to dominate. We wanted to be sort of living in harmony with the rest of the ecosystem. And I actually think that, diversity in the ecosystem is actually the way for its resilience. So if people want to learn languages, they can't come to Swinburne. I'm not sorry about that. There are plenty of other places where they can go for language. And you and I, Luca, share a love of language. It's not that
We
I
do.
don't like language. It's just that we're a university of technology. So come to us because we are a university at the human scale, but we still have a supercomputer. We still have amazing technology. We will have the Swinburne virtual universe that will all the kids from primary school onwards. We have this world-leading capacity to get to data that only NASA and Caltech has and no other Australian university has. So if that is what you want to do, come to us because we do it at the world-leading level. But
Yes.
if you want to do the things that we don't do, good luck. Just there's plenty of other institutions where you can go and get that. We're not going to try and be mediocre at a lot of things. We're just going to be excellent at a few things.
I was going to be my next kind of reflection, Pascal. This idea to be bigger usually means growth across all domains, and so in some ways it's a Faustian bargain. You end up being okay at a lot of things rather than really
Hmm.
specializing. And I think your point, like in nature, in nature, we think about biological systems and resilience, right? Everything is unique. It is specifically designed to have a specific feature within an ecosystem. So I find that a really compelling metaphor as well, not surprisingly, between the biological and the astrological, which of course you also like to speak to. I wanted to just double click a little bit more on this technology aspect because you are someone that is really paying attention to technology. And what do you see, even the whole idea of Chat GPT or Claude or Gemini, or all the other Copilot, all these different models, like what is your current position on how they can be used well? Because invariably students are using them now, teachers are using them, yeah, everybody's using them to some extent at very different levels of effectiveness, especially when it comes to the learning process that we're talking about and cognitive offloading and all those kinds of things. Give us a little bit of a picture in terms of where we are now. What do you think's underway?
So as you know, because I know you've read it, but our new strategic plan at Astra has got 4 quantum leaps. And the beauty of them is that they're all interconnected. We can't succeed at one if we fail at the others. And the first one is to deliver a very personalized, customized pathway to success. And by the way, this is for our learner, but it is also for our staff if they want to create a company, and it is to our partner if they want to kind of
Mm,
find a solution. But our second quantum leap is that we want to lean and infuse technology in everything we do. I think you'll find that 90% of the public discourse at the moment about AI is about the substitution to assessment and cheating on exams and all the rest of it. Well, it turns out that actually AI, if it is to be a substitute, probably would be a personalized tutor. It's endlessly patient. It never loses its nerves. And actually, some of the research that we do at Swinburne shows that it shapes very often more empathetic responses than a human would, particularly a human that is actually perhaps exasperated about being not understanding why the student doesn't get that very simple thing.
yes.
AI is a sort of smooth and will rephrase in a different way and will try a different definition and will show a different. So there is a benefit in the use of AI in the teaching. Forget about the assessment. In the teaching, in the capacity to phrase and rephrase and present the information in a variety of ways. And in the classroom, as you well know, you'll get the one kid who gets it first off, who's going to get royally bored by the time the teacher explains it the fifth time for little John at the back who still doesn't get it. And at the end of that hour, you'll have one really bored, bright student, one probably still not quite sure, sort of poor student or less able to understand the concept on the day. And then the others are somewhere in between. Well, AI actually tells you that you could actually tailor the experience and progress the learner, because this learner who got the concept first off on this day might actually be the one that doesn't get it 2 days later for another concept. So
Yes.
we want to be the university where not only do we lean and infuse technology in everything we do, we don't just teach technology, we demonstrate technology, we
Nice.
speak the truth about the technology, we provide and de-dramatize and de-demonize technology. We see what it can do as well as what it can't do. We're ready to kill the stuff that doesn't work, and we can speak from a position of informed, rational assessment of the merit of it, which probably means not reading the newspaper headline on it. Because they do the opposite, right? They
It
want to create
definitely means
the
that.
drama. They want to create the drama. They want to create fear. They want to create all of these things. We want to be the kind of the well-informed, sort of trusted expert in relation to that. But if we fail at our quantum leap too, which is to infuse technology in everything we do, not just teach it, but live it, we won't be able to deliver the personalized pathway to success, which is our quantum leap one. And our third quantum leap is we really want to kind of be there in creating the industries of the future, because we have ways of doing things that other universities do not have access to. And the fourth one is actually that we want to see the world as our campus. And unlike the other universities who tend to kind of just want to do a mini-me somewhere, like, we'll have a campus here and we'll have a campus there. We do have a beautiful campus in Malaysia, which is just fantastic. But there are some places where what they want is somebody who can help them with a curriculum. And in some places, they want some help or collaboration in relation to energy transition. And in others, they want to kind of know how it is that we're so successful in the innovation and, startup phase. So we don't have to be the same everywhere. And there is this kind of awful term that I got from the marketing literature a few years back, which is glocalization. We want to respond to local needs from a place of global expertise. And so that is very different from wanting to just clone ourselves, which in my mind proves just a certain degree of arrogance, like we're so good, we're going to clone ourselves. But
Yes.
also the very likely probability that you're going to miss the mark, because actually, as you know, other places are not like Australia. What they need is not what Australia needs. And so how about we listen to what they need and then provide what it is that we can help them acquire or grow. And at the end of the day, we are all in a similar business, I suppose, which is we are in the business of developing human capital, but it takes very different approaches to do that. And I think that's what we should be committed to.
I love that. It's almost like the idea of a kind of local science. You take the universal principles and then you apply them to the context. And context is queen, which is one of my favorite reflections, always. And I think it's why this scale construct doesn't always work out when we talk about human systems, Pascal. And this idea of like bigger is better. I've also heard scale is male and pale and stale. It's like everything's like, oh, we're going big. We're going to go like a billion users, etc. It's always the kind of, and like, it's great if you're solving a really key problem, but there's something about spreading instead of scaling, which I find far more compelling because it assumes agency and co-design at the local level versus we're doing this. Well, why are we doing this? Oh, because headquarters says that we do this, or
Because the others are doing it.
Oh, yeah, because the others are doing it. Oh, yeah, that's exactly right. And so we don't want to miss out on the way, rather than being unapologetically yourself as an organization. And of course, this all applies at an individual level as well. How do you individuate across your lifespan using learning as your vehicle so that you can become increasingly valuable, both in a marketplace and in a community? I think that's the core. I mean, that's what drives me, Pascal. It's like, can
Yeah.
you get to a place where everyone is as unique as possible rather than cloned. And then from that place, you can create value that is, your best place to create.
Yeah, and I mean, I subscribe to the view that you've got to make yourself increasingly valuable. But I'm going to say something that probably will shock you. I think there's real wisdom in trying to make yourself highly dispensable. And I think that's the success of good teaching. It's when the learner is equipped and can learn without you because they know how to learn. And so to me, the great achievement of the teacher is to make him or herself dispensable. If you make yourself more valuable, and in the process of making yourself more valuable, you make yourself indispensable, you're putting the learner in a position of fragility because you go and they're lost. And I think the real achievement of the teacher is to no longer be needed.
Mm. It's such an interesting, I mean, it's probably beyond the scope of this conversation, but you ultimately think about a company seeks to make itself indispensable in some ways, right?
Mhm.
Versus a social impact organization, which in some ways tries to solve the issue so that it no longer exists as an
That's
organization.
right.
It's a really interesting frame. We've got a few minutes left, Pascal. I want you to take us into the future. Like, let's go even beyond 2030. And I'd love for you to kind of map out what you think, one of the scenarios, perhaps even your preferred scenario is for the kind of human capital space in 2035, or even let's say 2040. That means you have to be a bit speculative, but you're very well placed to look at trends and signals. But where do you think we are heading? What's the destination that we're trying to, meander our way towards?
Well, to be honest, I see decreasing value in trying to predict anything. And in fact, even a statement that says our strategic plan goes to 2030 is kind of ignoring the fact that we are currently subject to such sometimes vindictive government decisions and hostile public discourse that in some ways it's probably a little bit, it's not very pragmatic to want to kind of project yourself in that time frame. I do think this is actually why there's such value in staying small and nimble. You don't know which direction things are going to go, but if you can run faster than the others and you can get to the hill if there's a flood, or to the clearing if there's a fire, that notion of being nimble and quick to change tack if need be, that is certainly one of the reasons why we don't want to get bigger, and why we absolutely want to develop the flexibility that comes from that vocational and higher education sort of kind of enrichment, if you like. We live in a troubled world, and I would think that one of the virtue, and it is actually part of the ideal of the university, is to really create people who reconnect with the capacity to have very respectful and civil conversation with people you fundamentally disagree with. And to me, the problem is, social media has been really problematic in that way, because it actually takes away any dissenting voices. And I just hate the simple fact that we have to have trigger warning to say to students, hang on, we're going to say something, and that's going to kind of cause a little bit of discomfort. Everything we say should create some discomfort, because otherwise nobody's learning, right? So it's, how do we make people resilient to dissent? And
Yeah.
how do we make them comfortable in disagreement? How does it not become personal? How does it not become an insult? How does it not become well, if you're not with me, you're against me, and therefore you deserve to die, which is kind of almost what the level of geopolitics has become now, right?
Yes.
So to me, there is a profoundly urgent need for universities to actually train people to be in that zone of discomfort that comes from being surrounded by people you either don't understand or don't agree with. And this is one of the reasons why I've been for a long time a strong advocate of student mobility, because
Right.
you can't really explain to anyone what being a foreigner is until they've been the foreigner. There's
Yes.
only a level of sympathy that people can say, there's foreigners everywhere and they don't eat the same food and they don't do this and that. Try being the foreigner. And all of a sudden you say, oh, geez, all those people think differently from me. And I'm the odd one out. And I'm going to have to understand why it is that they do the things they do. And rather than say they're all wrong and I'm right, I'm going to have to understand what it is to be in that group. if we could replicate this in a way that is safe, in a way that is kind of, I believe in vaccination. So there we go. We're going to have inoculation of dissent and discomfort until people build resilience and immunity to the kind of tripe that is going on social media, where young people believe and do not question opinions simply because that's what they kind of think. And therefore anybody who kind of thinks the same as them is going to reinforce them. So my optimistic view of the future is I hope we're going to save this planet. And, Swinburne has actually achieved carbon neutrality in November last year, which was no mean
Wow.
feat. I
Congratulations.
do hope we can save this planet, but I do think we've got to prepare for plan B. So space exploration, space, planet system might be handy to have. But if we go to another planet and start fighting with each other, we might as well stay here and vaporize, because that might actually be the best thing for the planet. So, if you ask me to really conjecture long term, I'd have to say we have a moment here where we can choose to either survive together or blow the place apart.
It's such a deep truth, Pascal. It's just the choice that we have, uh,
I'm all
in
for
every
saving the
moment.
planet.
No, me too. It's like there can be a plan B, but it's not going to be nearly as nice as this incredible planet that we're on. Such a great conversation, Pascal. Thank you so much for taking us into this world of learning technology. I just think there's so much here about owning your brand identity in particular and saying this is who we are unapologetically. There's definitely something there that can be kind of taken around strategic play, which is why I think you've done a great job on the strategy. My final question to you is just a take-home message that you have from your vantage point leading, a university in Australia at this moment in time. What's something that you would want to resonate in the minds of our listeners?
Well, I think universities are very often not just university, but schools. I would want us to all have a conversation around the learner so that we don't kind of separate the school from the TAFE, from the university. We're all into that human capital development. We do tend to talk about skills. We tend to talk about, I prefer to talk about capabilities. And one of these that you and I have just talked about is that kind of resilience element. How do we build stronger humans so that they can actually learn better, run faster, do more things, be more innovative, be more comfortable in discomfort and all the rest of it. So this element of, we don't do that by overprotecting people. We don't do that by not confronting people with difficult choices, but it's how do we do it in a way that is building them up rather than destroying them. That's the key to me.
I think it's so beautiful. The concept that I love is anti-fragility, of course, because I've come to Taleb's work recently, and it's just this idea that it's not even just to be resilient; it's to know that through adversity and struggle, I become stronger, and that I think is just the core part of a really powerful human development experience. Pascal, thank you so much for the work you do. Such a passionate advocate for what's possible. It's been a delight to have you on the Learning Future podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Louka.
Merci bien.